and welcome to another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. Today, I have the honor of having a conversation with Ryan Estrellado. Ryan is a writer, educator, and former school psychologist. He is the author of the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, Reimagining Practical Data Use in Schools, and a co-author of Data Science and Education Using R. Ryan tells inspiring stories about the reality of education work, ranging from overcoming a fear of data to finding a creative practice in the workplace. He has over 20 years of experience in public education and was also a featured speaker in one of my summer boot camps. Ryan lives with his family in San Diego, California. How are you doing today, Ryan? Thanks so much for being on the podcast.
Oh, thanks for asking me to be here. I'm doing fine. I'm a little nervous, but I'm so excited too. I'm really excited too. I haven't been on a podcast microphone for quite some time now, and I am ready to go.
Well, I was sharing with Ryan. Ryan does have a podcast himself. And the first question that I ask all of our guests, actually, the idea of having a question like this came from listening to his podcast. And yes, we will link in the show notes to his podcast as well. But we always like to ask all of our guests, what is your favorite TV show that you are watching right now?
I love this question. I'm going to say just really quick, I'm here as Ryan, the author. I have a day job. I'm not here representing my employer, obligated to say that. But now that is out of the way, I would love to talk about TV. I wish that I watch more TV. I just want to say that up front because I think this answer might be different if I watch as much TV as I aspire to. But with the second season of Severance coming out, I started rewatching the first one. No spoilers, Jenny, because I haven't started the second one yet if you're watching it. I really like that. I find that to be a pretty thought-provoking show. I think a lot of folks who know me know that I think constantly about how we identify with work and work-life balance, but also how much of ourselves that we bring to work. And I just find Severance to be a really deep exploration of that. And so I've enjoyed that quite a bit.
Okay, so I already have to ask you my first follow-up question. You
Yep,
said you
yep.
aspire to watching more TV. I know so many people would say they wish they got to watch less, right? So, well, what is that about?
Okay, so this is a really interesting question because I'm in my late 40s now. When I grew up, TV was kind of a thing that was like, it was seen as a child, it was seen as a waste of time. Like people would tell me like, "Oh, you watch too much TV, you should be, outside doing stuff." There's probably some merit to that. But I think what I've observed over time, I would love to hear, what others in the audience think, but I think what I've observed over time is people recognize TV as an art form in the way that other
Mhm.
things are an art form. And so I'm the type of person who am constantly inspired and energized by all kinds of different forms of art. I love TV. I love reading. I love video games. I love going to museums. And to me, wanting just to find more time to experience the way other people have constructed stories that's just something that I want more time to do because that makes me I feel it puts me in greater touch with who I am as a human being. And all of that stuff eventually, I know we like to think of these as separate things, but those things affect the way we show up for work. And so,
Mhm.
yeah, I really do wish I spent more time experiencing stories in like the TV format for sure. And I will, in time, I will find more time.
I love that. And I'm so glad I asked because that was not the answer I expected at all.
What did you expect?
I, a lot of people I think use TV as an escape and they use it as just, I don't have to think about work.
Oh, yeah,
And
sure.
so, I was curious, is it more like, I wish I had more time for that because I'm so busy with all these other things? But I
Mm.
love that experience. It made me really think about sometimes I have gone through those times in my life where I feel like I am watching TV just for the point of watching TV to
Mm.
just escape. And I'm not watching good TV. And in those instances, I have said to myself, like, I don't want to be
What am I
watching
doing?
TV just for the sake of this. Like, I feel like, my husband and I might be like searching for something that we could both like
Mm.
just for, just to say we're watching another TV show. And I love a good TV show. I
Yeah.
love a good story. I love those different pieces, but I don't like watching TV for the sake of watching TV.
Yeah. Yeah. I feel like you just struck on the very quandary of art and popular culture is like it is so intellectually stimulating. And on the other hand, we all need a break sometimes.
Yeah.
We just do. That's
Absolutely.
okay.
Absolutely. Well, we love to ask our guests too, what is a word your colleagues might use to describe you? And we're going to use the term educator because you've had so
Yeah.
many different roles.
Yeah. I gotta be honest, I was kind of stuck on this one because I know what I wish my colleagues would think about me. What they actually think about me, I don't know. I think people would describe me as honest.
Okay.
I think people would describe me as a communicator. I think when I was a school psych, just so full transparency for the audience, I haven't been a school psychologist since, boy, the 2008, 2009 or so. We were talking before we started this about how nervous I was to come out and speak to that experience because I don't know how much of that practical advice would resonate with a modern school psychologist. But
Hmm.
I will say, strangely, I think about school psychology all the time. I've worked different jobs since then in different areas, and I still think about it. And when I reflect back on that, I do often wonder like how I came off to people and how helpful that was. I think at the time I was so concerned with doing everything perfectly. I think the word people would have used was conscientious.
Okay.
I, I like that word, but I think
Okay.
maybe we can sort of explore later the burdens of that sometimes in school psychology can be really, really tough. So yeah, I think those are what people would have thought of me back then. I think people still would use that word now probably, but I like to think a more sort of mature and practical form.
Yeah, I'm curious because you said a kind of a distinction, what I wish they would have said.
Yeah.
What would that be? What would kind of be in that category?
When I was a school psychologist, I really hoped to be somebody that people felt they could connect with, that they felt comfortable with. I think on some level that probably I did achieve that. On another level, with hindsight, many, many
Hmm.
years later, there were some parts of the job that I took so seriously at the expense of human connections with my teammates and with families that I know if I, in some, alternate universe, if I were to go back and do it again, I think I would probably do that differently.
Hmm.
And it's not to blame my younger self. I think you go into a career, and I think as when you are new in your career, there are so many variables that drive how you behave in that job, the development of your craft, for example, but also the desire to prove yourself as a young professional really drove a lot of the way I thought about work. What I noticed over time, and by that I mean like many, many, many years, is you achieve a few things, you sort of proven yourself as somebody who does a pretty decent job. And when you are concerned a little bit less about needing to prove yourself, other parts of your game begin to open up that weren't available. You take more risks for the sake of doing things better, for connecting with people and having tough conversations. That's much, much harder, I think, as somebody day one on the job. Really tough. You're going into a system where people have opinions and you're largely trying to conform because you want to keep your job. And that's really understandable and great. But I think as one matures into their profession, they take on the role of understanding where the problems are and they begin to unpack those a little bit, talk a little more honestly about those, not to complain, but for the purpose of having a better sort of professional community that is driving towards what we think is sort of a better way to do things. I think it's not true only in school psychology, but in general.
Well, you have had a very diverse career in education. You've been a school psych, you've been an administrator, you've been a data scientist. How have all these different roles really shaped your understanding of all of the different challenges as well as our opportunities in education?
Yeah, it's interesting. The way I think about this is when I was a school psychologist, I was constantly feeling like I could see where the problems in the system were that made being successful as a school psychologist hard. I could see them so clearly, between more evaluations than you had time to complete them for the kinds of necessary but sometimes burdensome bureaucracies of compliance and things like it. You could just see it so clearly about how that both helped the work and also got in the way of the work at the same time. But the issue was I would go home after a long day and I would think, I just don't have time to be a part of changing that because this week I've got, 3 evals, 5 evals, IEPs or whatever. So in time, I kind of moved on from school psychology, went into administration and at both the district level and the county level, and then now at state government. And in a way, that was a gift in the sense that it's like, wow, now, I'm on kind of like the outer rings of the system here. Like I receive my paycheck in return for solving those problems.
Mm,
And that's really great. It's exciting until you discover, or I discovered anyway, that I suffered from then the inverse of the quandary, which is now I have time, resources, like minds to solve systems problems, but I no longer have access to what those problems are. And
mm,
that's a really interesting thing that I think I can only have discovered as I explore different possibilities in careers. What ends up happening is I have, in past sort of work and experiences, built things that I was really proud of, but unfortunately didn't help people as much as I thought it would be. And the sort of the missing piece there is that practitioners I needed to have created more opportunities for practitioners to say, hey, this thing that you're building, hmm, it's good spirited, but like, we have
yeah.
this other problem that we need to solve, right? So
Mm,
you got the problems on the ground, you got the people who can be a part of creating interesting solutions. And what I've learned only through kind of having different types of jobs is
yeah.
that those folks need to be in community with each other in order to build things that have a genuine sort of positive impact on the way school psychology works, schools work, and the way government works, all kinds of sort of large institutions.
I think it's interesting. I know personally a number of school psychologists like yourself who have moved into different roles, who other people I've known who have then gone and returned back to the school psychologist role.
Yeah.
It's like they've moved up into administration, then moved back down. And I know thinking about, the time I spent working at the county office as well, and then realizing I felt very far away from the students themselves. Like I
Yeah.
was teaching the teachers how to teach students. And
Mhm.
I felt like there was this big disconnect and there was this definitely that part of me that this new role that I had for this period of time was fulfilling. I wanted to be able to help support more students than just, sometimes as a school psychologist, you just feel like, the starfish story, one starfish at a time. All right, I'm
Mhm.
getting
Mhm.
through, I'm getting through. And I was like, this
Mhm.
is that opportunity where I get to have that bigger impact.
Yeah.
But then I felt so far away from the impact.
Yeah.
And that was hard for me to not be able to experience the impact or the
That's right.
effect of everything that we were doing at our level.
That's right. You mentioned my book earlier, the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook. In that book, I have a story. Actually, I don't off the top of my head remember if the story made it into the book, but in my research for the book, I interviewed a bunch of teachers. And there was one teacher who talked about the experience of having administrators come to visit. I think in this case, it was like administrators from the county who want to help, of course. And very often the way that help looks like is through new programs, kind of different ways of doing things. That's sort of what we need. I think personally, what we need from folks who are in that part of the system. But the experience from the point of view of the teacher was that the folks would come and visit the schools and had really great ideas that were probably better executed on a longer time horizon,
Mm,
for the next year, next 5 years, and didn't quite address the more near-term problems that the teacher had. And she used an analogy that I've never been able to shake from my head. She said, it's like having somebody come to sell you a brand new sprinkler system when the actual problem is like your lawn is on fire right now and you don't really care where the water comes from. We just need to put that out. And then can we just talk about overhauling the sprinkler system afterwards? Of course, the reality is, if we never stop to think about why immediate problems start, the underlying kind of systems causes of that, then they perpetuate. So I think, the important word here is balance. Like there has to
mhm.
be the right balance between let's solve the immediate problems plus let's invest in the future so that we have a more sane workplace for folks on the ground. And thus, through that kind of sane workplace, we have something that feels really great for kids. And that's so hard to do. It's so,
Yeah.
so hard to do. But we can at least say, like, I think that is the tension.
Well, you talked about your book, the K-12 Educator's Data Guidebook, and I love that one of the focuses in the book is really humanizing the data that we're using in schools. So when you think about data that's being used in education, what do you think are some of the common misconceptions about data, and how does your book kind of challenge those assumptions?
I could approach that from a couple of different angles, but I think a really important one, it took a long time for me to figure out. I've felt this for a long time, but it took a long time for me to figure out like the right words for it. And that is that I found myself as a younger professional going to data because I believed it afforded me certainty where I otherwise wouldn't have it. And that's not exactly true. That's not, and I think there is a sort of dark side to that where we can begin to believe that data tells all of the sort of truth about a situation. And I think the danger of that is we can begin to use data as a way to end conversations versus start them, which is really
Mhm.
what they should be. They kind of point you in the right direction. They can get you unstuck in tough decisions, but they are not in and of themselves proof of a particular thing, especially when it's like we're talking about one data point, a single
Mhm.
test, a single grade, a single, behavior sheet or something. I think that's a really scary notion to people because it means that you as a expert user of data still have to grapple with uncertainty. And I mean, I'm here to say, having worked with data for like, I just don't, I've always thought about data. It's never been true that I'm like, oh, finally, we have the perfect data set and I've achieved perfect certainty. It doesn't work. And I'll tell you
No.
too, like, I remember feeling so distraught as like a school psychologist when I've given two tests that were designed to measure the same thing and they had drastically different scores.
Yeah.
I just felt so much stress from that because of what I now understand, false belief that these are perfect instruments, right?
Mhm.
And I think once you start to realize these are little measurements, right? In the same way that like a blood test is a measurement. You're not like you're not measuring an entire like person's amount of blood. This is examples getting gross, but it's like you're taking a sample, right? And so
Right.
what that means is you got some clues about what might be happening. And technology, both in medicine but also in school psychology and instruments, has progressed to the point, of course, where we can do that better probably than we ever have.
Right.
But the point is, this is a measurement on a day that's got a lot of variables into it. And it is our responsibility to look at that in a nuanced way, largely by number one, admitting that none of these things are proof. And then number two, gathering as much of this data as we can so that we lessen that uncertainty and the picture begins to make sense. I think that's like, to me, is the biggest thing. I hear people say things like the numbers don't lie and stuff like that. I think there was a time and place for a saying like that, I think, where nobody was using data and I think it made sense. But like, as I said in the book, like the reason why the numbers don't lie is because they don't do anything. They're just numbers. They don't lie. They don't tell the truth. They don't do anything. You are the one who sort of looks at that and says like,
Mhm.
okay, let's assemble a picture here that makes sense so that we can make some decisions for this kid.
As you were sharing that made me think about how many times myself as a school psych or consulting on cases nowadays where we're doing a reevaluation for a student.
Yeah,
And 3 years ago, everyone was very certain we figured it out.
that's right.
And we said, this is their processing disorder. And then 3 years later, we're like, that was wrong completely.
Yeah, yeah, yeah,
And this is their processing disorder. And well, I found two subtests that aligned. So,
yeah,
like you said, the numbers don't lie. And earlier on in my career versus how I'm thinking today about it, how I'm
yeah,
thinking today about it, I'm like, of course it changes
yeah.
because I just based it on a couple of subtests and I
Hmm.
didn't look at like, what does this actually mean? Did I actually double check to
Yeah,
see like these low fluid reasoning scores? Did I ask anyone any questions about fluid reasoning?
yeah.
And I'm just feeling very certain because I got these subtests and then I even gave another subtest. It was also low.
That's right. That's right. Yeah.
And I walk in with a level of certainty because we want to. We want to. I mean, we are making important decisions about
Hmm.
children's lives.
Yep.
And I think it would be hard for us to walk in and be like, we think it's a learning disability. I don't know. It could be autism. I'm
That's
not sure.
right. Yeah.
Like, we
Yeah.
need to have some level of certainty.
For sure.
But I love this conversation because, yeah, the tools we use today versus when I started in this field, so much better.
Yeah.
And the tools were never meant to be used in a
That's
vacuum.
right. Can I say, like, I love that you said, you pointed to something that felt so real to me, which is one of the factors here that makes this really hard is nobody wants to go into that meeting and being like, these tools aren't perfect, everybody. Now let's make some really high stakes decisions. And I feel like if I were to go back, the way that I would say, I feel like once you begin to see the level of nuance that you and I are talking about here, I would feel compelled to slowly but surely begin to talk about them in that way so that we kind of renorm what these tests mean, right? In
Mm-hmm.
the long term. Because you'll have to tell me if this still happens, but I had countless times that people were like, wait a minute, the learning disability is supposed to have, this is probably different now, but like back then we would measure gaps in these expected sort of scores, of
Mm-hmm.
course. And we like, the threshold is 15. This is 16. And I'm like, it doesn't work like that, you guys. Like, you're not taking a measuring tape and then measuring the length of a table. That is a high certainty measurement, right? You're going
Right.
to do that 1,000 times, you're probably going to come out with the same measurement, right? This is not that kind of thing.
Exactly.
And I think the way I would probably approach this is to go to a meeting and say, hey, listen, I've drawn some conclusions I feel fairly strongly about. And I'd like to highlight why I think that way. And here are we measure this in a bunch of different ways, both quantitatively, anecdotally, through records and stuff like that. And there are kind of three sort of main data points here that I think really tell the story that when we reflect on the original referral question,
Right.
this picture begins to make sense. I would love to hear if it also makes sense to you. Let me
Mm.
go through that. And I think what that does is it kind of pulls the curtain back a little bit on the nuance analysis required to make these kinds of decisions for students. I think is so much more honest than saying, hey, if there's a 15-point gap between this score and this score, then we can do an IEP.
Right.
I guess that's true, but it doesn't quite feel like real life. And, it's
Mm-hmm.
certainly, when I was thinking about it that way, it certainly put me in situations that were just really stressful and fraught because I think I couldn't sufficiently fool my brain into thinking that that was like the truth. And I knew as I sort of walked through these conversations, I'm like, this isn't nuanced enough, and I don't quite know how to unpack it, and I think I would do that differently if I were to come back.
Well, one of the words that you used was storytelling,
Hmm.
and you emphasized the importance of storytelling with data. And it was interesting when you were talking about what kind of words people would use to describe you. That was one of the words that I associate with you is a storyteller. And I didn't know you as well, back when you were early years a school psychologist. So this might be more of a newer term, but I'm interested in, could you share an example where you feel like that storytelling has really helped influence change in an educational setting? Hello, school psychologist. I have some exciting news for you that you won't want to miss. The Prepared School Psych community has extended our free trial to a full 4 weeks, giving you plenty of time to explore all the resources, select mini courses, and professional development tools that we offer. That's right, 4 weeks to explore mini courses on FBAs and preschool assessment with CEU opportunities, plus full access to video and downloadable resources on assessment, behavior, counseling, report writing, and eligibility, and more. You will also get our new eligibility checklist and multiple ways to get your questions answered by me and my 4 content specialists. I know you're busy, and this extra time gives you the space to fully take in all of the valuable content we've created to support your growth and help with the challenges you face in your role. So, are you ready to see what's inside? Sign up for your 4 week free trial today at jennyponzuric.com/podcast and use podcast to take full advantage of these valuable resources. Can't wait to see you inside.
Yeah. Yeah, for sure. I mean, first, It's helpful to define just the way I see storytelling because I think we can say that and it means a lot of different things to people. And I mean it in a very specific way, which is the careful and thoughtful arrangement of key events or ideas such that the person that you are sharing with can engage it. I think the work of a school psychologist is so complicated, has so many different parts. And I think, when you've done that job enough, those parts become automatic to you, which is great because that means you can work faster. There does come a point eventually where you have to convey, you have to do the handoff to the next person, whether that's the teacher who has to do the instruction or the parent who has to understand what is happening with their child. And story is important there because in order to do that effectively, I've come to learn you have to find the parts and all of the complexity that really matter, and then you have to sequence them in a way that is logical. And then you have to metaphorically hold the hand of the person who you're trying to convey this to through each of those parts in a way that they're like, now I understand.
Mm.
And I think there are so many opportunities, not just in education or school psychology, but in any job to be able to do that well. This is one of those things that I constantly think if I were to do an IEP meeting again, I would love to try it this way. So I can't directly answer your question because I haven't yet gotten a chance to try
Mm-hmm.
this. Probably never will, but like I have done versions of this in other jobs where I've had to go really deep into a project, become the person who probably understands it the best, and then convey it to somebody who has to make a decision based on that information. But let's just like make it really concrete to answer your question. I think like if you think about an IEP meeting and the way that we present, or I'll just say the way that I presented results, it, talking about sequence, I would sort of, the way I generated the results was in a particular sequence. I gave all the tests, many, many tests, like hours and hours and hours. I would score all the tests. I would look at literally every single number. I would find the patterns, draw a conclusion. If I had time, I might like make a little note about something funny that happened during the test thing. And then I would show up to the IEP and I'm like, okay, I hope everybody has their coffee because I am now going to tell you everything that happened. It started 60 days ago when I gave this first test. And then I would like make them redo the eval with me essentially, right? And like some people like that.
Yeah.
Most people, in my experience, most people are just like, oh my God, this is so boring. And I understand why. And like to go back to your question, how does story sort of change things? This is a place where like the sequence matters, right? So you have some key events here. You have, namely, the drawing of the conclusion. Oh, I understand what's happening. I think I understand what's happening now, right? So that's kind of one event. And then you've got like the discovery of these data points. They're very often like, I don't know, 5 out of the 100 that you have or something like that. Or, it's not all of them is the point.
Right.
The discovery of these data points, whether it's like a particular processing test or a thing that like 7 people said in interviews or something like that, or preferably all of those together.
Yes.
And you discover that and it sort of helps you put the picture together. And so the sequence, I think, at least in the way that I convey complex ideas in my current job and as an author, is to start with that story first and to say like, can't wait to jump into this report, but I first want to share something that when I asked Maria this question, this is what she said. And doesn't that say so much about who she is, right? Like it's just so interesting. Like I've gotten to know her now over like the past couple of weeks, and it just that moment really made me feel like that's exactly what she would do. That's sort of like that's a story kind of brings everybody together. And then let me unpack a little bit about what I think could be driving some of the things that we're worried about. And it's this particular processing area, right? Now you're going a little bit into the analysis, but you're telling people the larger theme. So in the sequence of sort of events, you got this overview. Now you have a little bit of the analysis, which is the theme. And next in the sequence is the part where you deliver some credibility to your audience, where you say like, I'll just sort of, this is a very lengthy process to discover these things, but I want to tell you like 3 data points that I really felt, helped me discover what I think is happening here. It's these 3 things, right? And that's a story to me. It's very, again, going back to my original definition here, it is key element sequenced thoughtfully so that the audience can engage it. It means something to them now. And if you compare that to the opposite of that, which is going through test by test by test, that's a really tough thing to engage. and for most people, in my
Yeah.
experience. So that's one of many, many, many examples. I know that your audience can take that general idea and extrapolate it out to so many different situations, but that's one in particular.
Well, and you and I have had a similar conversation during one of my summer boot camp sessions, and you actually took a snippet from that conversation and put a video link on your website, which of course I will put a link in the show notes here as well. And I think you titled it something like How to Not Make People Fall Asleep During IEP Meetings
That's
or
right. Yeah.
something like that.
Hmm.
And I have shared that video in a number of trainings that I've done. And it's really an interesting aha moment I have found from the people who have participated in the training because it makes sense, but it's not how most of us were ever trained.
That's right. Yeah. Can I ask you a question about that? I
Yeah.
I've always wondered if that idea, like if somebody tried that idea, my fear was always that the traditions of school psychology would like push back at that and just be like, what is this newfangled, this weird guy doing this artistic sort of rendition of a thing? Do you feel like it would land? So I can say with a fair amount of confidence that a parent would be like, oh man, this is much better. I know that for sure. But do you think that like the school psychologist community would sort of be like, that's so different from the way we've ever done it. I actually don't know if I could do it.
One of the things I have found is some people are embracing that
Yeah.
idea, and it's almost like through the training, they gain that permission to
Oh,
try
interesting.
something that actually
Yeah.
makes sense to them, to their core.
Yep.
I think for a lot of people in our field, because like you said, we have very complicated cases, we have a lot of data, that it would be something. I'm not saying we have to go back to school for it, but it's like I would
Hmm.
need to hear like 10 examples of what
Yeah.
this
I
might sound like. And I know for myself, that's one of the things that I've been trying to improve upon, whether it's in my private practice and debriefing with families, where I get a lot more flexibility because there is no IEP. I just get to decide this is how I'm going to explain the results to you. We still have a report that's written in a certain order so that if you need to share that with anyone, it's got all of those
That's right.
requirements.
Yep.
But even in IEP meetings that I still get to participate in, I'm playing around with that a little bit more.
Yeah.
And I think part of it is knowing your audience because I
Yep.
will always say, one of my questions that I want to answer for the IEP team or in my private practice is this is what I learned about your student.
Yep.
Like instead of this test score, this, like I gave a bunch of tests. I also talked to everyone who would talk to me. I have
Hmm.
looked at every single piece of paper in your child's file.
That's right.
This is what I learned. Like
Yep.
that's my question I'm trying to answer walking in, which takes my perspective on the explanation very differently.
Yeah.
But that's been a lot of practice on my part.
Yeah.
And I have been in some interesting meetings with advocates and attorneys and different parents. And there's some who would totally appreciate that. Because,
Yeah.
like you said, most people appreciate that.
Yep.
But then there's some people that have already had experiences with them. And I'm like,
Yeah.
they're going to want to go through the data piece by piece.
Sure.
And
Yeah.
that's fine because I think one of the things that maybe we don't get at the beginning of our career, but as we're maturing and learning, is to kind of change and adapt. This is this kind
Oh,
of meeting
yes.
I'm going into. This is the parent's 15th IEP for
Yep.
their fifth child. Like maybe we don't need to go through every single data piece versus this is the first time this parent is hearing this. They might need a lot of this data.
That's right.
They might need a little bit more of the piece by piece types of things. First year as a school psychologist, no, I'm just going to explain it the one way I know how to explain it because
Yeah.
that's the only one way
That's
I
right.
know how to explain it.
Yep.
And I think in our field, one of the things I don't know how to fix it is that after your internship year, rarely as a school psychologist am I ever in a meeting with another school psychologist.
Oh, so true.
You don't even get to hear how other people explain results. And a colleague and myself, we recently did a live training series inside the Prepared School Psych platform. And one of the things we did is I actually shared a video. This is how I explain results.
Yeah.
And then my co-presenter, she's like, this is how I explain results. And I was so excited because I've worked with her for many years. I've never been in an IEP
That
meeting before.
feels like what you just described, that experience feels groundbreaking, which is strange.
It's odd. It's
Yeah,
odd. But yeah, if you think about it, you get to hear your supervisors. You might have role played in
yeah,
your university program, but it's a pretty rare occasion.
yeah,
Maybe if you happen to sit through like an independent educational evaluation, you get to hear someone else at least
that's right.
present, your similar kind of results. Sometimes I'm like, oh, I really like how they said that, but
Yeah,
it's
that's right.
it's interesting because how are we supposed to grow and change if A, no one's ever told us, half the time we've never been given any feedback,
Yep,
and we don't have those examples and those experiences. So
yep.
just some different things to think about.
I think that's so real because it's faster and more convenient to do things the same way as they've always done. I think that's the reality,
Absolutely.
right? It's hard and risky to try different things. And certainly some things are so risky that you just shouldn't try it. That's true. All of that is true, right? So you touched on something that I thought was really important, which is the what I think is the false distinction between a simple delivery and a non-credible delivery,
Mm,
right? Like, so just me be a little more concrete about that. I totally reject the idea that a simple delivery is like that because it is a less credible delivery.
mm,
In fact, I think it's the opposite. I think
yeah.
an effective simple delivery is like that because the school psychologist has gone through every single possible thing, brings enough rigor to the analysis that they can expertly pick the points that tell the story the best. And I suppose you could look at two simple deliveries, and one of them could be simple because of a really thorough evaluation of the available data, and another could be simple because the evaluation itself was simple.
Hmm.
Obviously, not advocating for that, but I feel like you can tell right away which is which because what inevitably happens after the delivery is there are going to be some questions, as there ought to be, from parents and advocates and staff and everything like that. And I like that part of the meeting because that is the point where people are beginning to communicate to you what they need to know more about. And because your evaluation was so thorough, you will have answers to all of those questions.
Hmm.
Now, the simple deliveries that are simple because the evaluation is simple, it's going to fall apart right in that
Right.
moment because people are just going to be like, yeah, but like, what about this other part? And that person's going to be like, I don't know. Can we sign
Yeah.
another eval plan? And then I'll tell you again. Whereas like the person who, like, I am so proud of staff and other people that I see where they receive a tough question and the way that they start that response is to say, that's a really great question. I thought about that and let me explain to you sort of what my experience was. I love that because it to me that is the mark of a professional who has not only like looked under every turned over every rock, but then has done the work to curate the sort of the data points and the elements of the story that will effectively convey the information that that group of people needs to know to make a plan for the child.
Hmm.
And I love that. I just think it's such a pro, thing when I see it.
Well, we talked a little bit about some people need more examples. We don't always have those opportunities. I will say, with one district that I work with, we actually offered that to different school psychologists. If you would like to go to someone else's IEP meeting just to listen, like don't go to like some IEP meeting. You don't
Yeah,
want your name on every single
that's
piece of
right.
paper, but
Exactly.
just for that experience of listening, what might be some other kind of practical strategies for people who may want to practice this storytelling or practice a different way of sharing these different results?
Yeah, I think one way to do this is to have a template
Mm,
of mental template of how you tell these stories. There's an efficiency in that, I find. I'll give you like an example of a template, and then I would like to make a suggestion for how people can sort of make their own, right? So first, an example is exactly what it's sort of what I talked about earlier, which is to start first with a story about a thing that actually happened while you're testing that says something about the child, right? And this should sort of bring everybody in the room together to focus because they're like, oh yeah, that's definitely, the student. That's element number one, the template. Element number two are your main conclusions. These should be like one, maybe two things. They should connect directly to the referral question. You should be able to say them in 3 or 4 sentences. They're not going to feel rigorous on their own, but they will be clear. So, examples. There's evidence here of a visual processing disorder, and that may go a long way to explain why these particular concerns are happening, right? That's number two in the template. And then number three is data points, specific data points. And what I mean, I don't know if that's a term we use in school psychology, but what it means is like a particular subtest score,
Mm-hmm.
preferably like just for methodology reasons, like a index, a thing that sort of
Right.
actually gathers like a bunch of them to show why the conclusion that you drew in the previous part of the template makes sense. And it should make sense. One thing I always focus on even now when I do analysis and I think through stuff is I have to be able to convince myself. Like I can't fool my brain. If I'm like lying to
Mm-hmm.
myself about something, I just have to be honest about that. And I have to be
Yeah.
like, that's actually not true. Because when you get there, then you can explain stuff really well. And that's a really nice template. Maybe the last part of the template, I would love to hear your questions about
Mhm.
what else you would like to understand about what this experience was like. And so feel free to steal that template and use it. But I want people to feel empowered to like, after you've gotten a bunch of IEP presentations under your belt, to take note of the ones that you're like, this one that I did on such and such date really worked. I don't know why it
Mm-hmm.
worked, but I just know that we made really great decisions afterwards. The whole vibe was good. People didn't fall asleep. Like it's just good. And to take that and to unpack it and say, like, what happened here? And how can I create a template from this so that this is a repeatable thing,
Mm-hmm.
right? That like I'm showing up consistently. Like, nobody's perfect, so you get bad days, of course, but like
Yes.
7 out of 10, 8 out of 10 IEP meetings, I'm just landing it like this all the time. I think there's a few things that are nice about that. Number one, there's efficiency. Number two,
Mm-hmm.
to me, it is less stressful, right? Because if you don't do that, then what you're doing is like, okay, I have to like every single time I say, what's the story here? What's the story? And like that's fun for the first few times until you're just like, I have so many of these. I don't care about the story anymore. I just have to go do a template
Right.
is like, let me just work through the list, right?
Mm-hmm.
Last thing from a longer kind of like professional sort of career trajectory thing is to me, that's a real authentic, like a real honest way to begin to develop a signature where you're just like, if everybody shut the lights on, they just listen to the person, they're like, that's Jenny.
Right.
That's the way she does it. Those types of things happen kind of later on in the career, but they happen because of a consistent delivery of something that works. And I think if you've developed a template for that delivery based on something you've done in the past that does work, then it becomes unique to you.
Mm-hmm.
And that's really awesome. I just think that it can make you feel really empowered as a professional in a profession that is sometimes doesn't have a lot of opportunities to feel that when it's really
Right.
stressful.
Right.
School psychologists really need that. Human beings need that. But like, I just remember as a school psychologist being like, I feel like I'm spinning my wheels here and not ever getting a foothold in I, we have to find those opportunities for ourselves, I think.
I love that. I love that template. I think one of the things that has helped me in similar situations where like I'm trying out something new or, just I'm going to tweak something a little bit.
Yep.
Maybe not everyone on the team, but your go-to people who have heard you in your
Yes.
previous templates. Because I like to give them a heads up. I'm going to try
Yeah, that's
something
right.
a little bit different at this meeting.
Yep.
I would love to know how you think it lands.
Mm-hmm.
Someone who is going to be able to give you
A
actual,
100%.
helpful, constructive feedback, not just that was fabulous. And everyone's like, what was she doing?
Yeah.
But to get some of that, because I know some of us have those moments of, like you said, it's almost just like a gut reaction of like, that meeting went really well.
Yeah, that's right.
Right. Like I landed that one. Like I
Mm-hmm.
wish that one was being recorded. That one
Yeah.
was good. And
Mm-hmm.
I think more often we walk away from meetings going like, I could have done a lot better. Like
Mm-hmm.
wow, was not prepared.
Yeah,
Like
right.
did
Right.
not fully ground myself before walking into this meeting. But I think sometimes to get some feedback from those that trust can give
Yeah,
some good feedback, but also who sit through 9,000 IEP meetings with
that's
you.
right. Yep. Yeah.
I think that can be nice. And I think sometimes thinking about other people who have had those other experiences with others. A lot of times I think about like my elementary school, like one of them, like my specific team, we were together for 7 years. No one moved. I had the same SLP. I had the same special ed teacher. We had the same administrator. Like it was this really amazing team, but we never got to see other people. And
Yeah.
so when I happen to have a program specialist come to a meeting because that was necessary,
Yes.
it's almost like here's a new person who gets to go to IEP meetings across this district. That might be a good person to check in with and just be like, hey, do you have any feedback? You get to hear other people
Yeah.
to get
It's
some of
it
that
yeah,
feedback.
100%. It's essential for how things develop and improve.
Hmm.
And yet at the same time, you have to embrace the vulnerability. It is the hardest. A lot of my work is around design of data products. And it's another version of exactly what you said, which is like these things that we make are never going to be good unless we have direct responses from the people who these are meant to help.
Yeah.
It has to happen. And I 100% think it is also true, as you said, in these situations where you're trying to develop and improve anything, I think, in the kind of the school psychologist list of job duties, but in this particular example, how we do IEP meetings and how we present data. And I also want to acknowledge that part of the craft is to know that it's not going to be for everybody. People will let you know, usually not shy. All information is helpful. Another way to think about it is you have to make, as the person who is trying to improve, you have to make judgments about how to weight feedback as it comes in.
Hmm.
I know this probably doesn't sound great to people, but in my view, it's the truth. Not all feedback is equally useful. It is helpful. All feedback 100% is helpful, but there's this step where, as the designer, the person who's trying to improve, you kind of have to look at each of the bits and you're just like, this piece of feedback that came from a professional who makes me feel like I want to be where they are in 10 years, I put a lot of weight on that
Right.
because what they are telling me is from an instinct that resulted in them being there.
Hmm.
Put a lot of weight there. This one over here maybe has some like different values of the way school should work. Thank you. I will continue to listen, but less weight on that one. And these are personal judgments, right? And also, by the
Yeah.
way, it probably goes without saying, like we don't reason through these things in front of people. This is like your own personal process that you kind of go through for yourself, maybe with a mentor that you trust or something like that, peers that you trust who are kind of in it together. But it's really tough because folks who aren't so interested in changing like to give feedback too. And it's easy to give feedback when you don't want to change. I tend to put less weight on that. I do listen to it, of course, but I put a lot of weight on feedback from people who are also like struggling to get better because I'm just like, oh,
Hmm.
they know like this is a kindred spirit, right? Maybe even if we have different, I have so many people in my network and in my life who just have different views than I have, but their thinking style is I aspire to it. And so, even if they don't necessarily agree with like the way I deliver a talk or the way I write an article or something like that, I definitely want to hear from them because I know their thought process is really strong.
Hmm.
And I know that they themselves struggle to sort of improve and do stuff like that. So I think that's kind of a lesson that is important to know. It's like doing an evaluation, right? You do all of these tests. Some of these tests are normed really strongly, and that takes some of the uncertainty out of it. Some of these other
Yeah.
tests they're not normed on like a rigorous enough sort of platform, or they're kind of normed in a population that makes it less certain for like the group of kids you're working on or something like that. But that's
Right.
okay. You still give the test and you evaluate the weight that you give it as a piece of evidence. Same
Exactly.
thing.
Exactly. Well, part of what we were talking about too is everyone's individual piece here, and part of that is also the creativity that you are bringing. Some people want to bring more creativity in. How do you see this connection between analyzing data and creativity?
So there's a camp of people who define creativity as finding connections between things that don't feel like they have connections to them. I don't want to misattribute here, but I think I've heard Brene Brown say that. I think Steve Jobs sort of said something similar. I mean, lots of folks have said that. And I think a real practical way that that applies to school psychology and data is to find connections, really practical connections between data and what you're trying to accomplish in your work. I think it's worth saying that we have lots of data available to us, but not all of it makes sense. For example, not all of it makes sense for what we're trying to accomplish.
Right.
It makes sense, lots of sense for what other people are trying to accomplish. But just because the data exists doesn't necessarily mean the connection is there to your decisions that you have to make, right? So let me just get really like concrete about this. I think there are three things that a school psychologist can do the work of connecting that will make how they use data more meaningful. And that is what your actual job duties are. So, and get really specific here, evaluations, counseling, is it writing effective behavior plans? Like there is something that you get paid to do that people are relying on you to do really well, right?
Mhm.
What is that? Really specifically, beyond just the general, of course, we're all here to help kids, but like everybody has a job, right? And like, what is that? That's element number one. Connect that to element number two, find the connection, which is what are the day-to-day decisions that you have to make that when you make these decisions really, really well, you do the jobs that you identified in element number one, right? So get concrete there. If your job is to write effective behavior plans, it seems to me that a decision you would make pretty regularly is should we continue with this intervention that we're trying, or should we try something else? People rely on you to participate in that decision, if not actually just make it yourself, right? If you make that decision consistently really well, it stands to reason that then you will have accomplished the job duty you identified, which is writing effective behavior plans. So now you've got this connection. What your job is, the related decisions. Okay, the third thing then that you connect is what is the data that is available to you that will help you make those decisions better? And I encourage folks to think broadly here, certainly quantitative. I tend to lean quantitatively myself, but the truth is data is any kind of information external to you that will help affirm or challenge or mature your initial ideas of what's happening, right? So seek all of that stuff out. Your observation notes, your behavior charts, your interviews, records. It's been so long since I've done this job. I'm sure there are many like other sources of data and connect that directly to the decisions that you have to make. The example that we used here was, should we continue this intervention or should we try something differently? And so if you've got records that tell you how long you've been doing that intervention, and plus you've got this larger kind of background knowledge that is based on data about how long on average interventions need to go for, kind of considering that. Plus you've got, these day-to-day records that you can sort of look to see, like, were there days that it actually went well or not? Like you're beginning to like all of that stuff, you're throwing it, the way I kind of think of it is you're throwing it into a blender and you're sort of just like looking at it and you're like, ultimately, by the way, this is sort of like this thing between, are you more of an intuitive person or like a data-driven person? It's like, I don't buy that. It's the same thing, right? The only difference is, are you going with your intuition in the face of a lot of information or with no information?
Mm.
Ultimately, it's still intuition, right? Have you ever like, I'm asking rhetorically, I know you've seen this, where you read like an eval that was like done like 3 years ago, and then you're like evaluating a child and you're like, man, I mean, I could see why you drew this conclusion, but that's not the way I would have done it. Like that's a thing that
Hmm.
happens, right?
Right.
And it's not because one person's wrong and one person's not. It's because, we're bringing our sort of analytic disposition to these, truthful, like these sort of procedural pressures and stuff like that kind of come into this. And we make the best decision we can that is ultimately intuitive. And so the difference is like, how do you sort of respond to the data? So going back to your question, like, how do you make data collection more creative? You're finding connections between these three things that are like, now my system for doing my job is data driven in a way that is very specific and meaningful to what I am paid to do, which in our
Mm.
example was, do effective behavior reports. That in itself is an extremely creative process because of all the things that you talked about earlier. You got to try something new, you got to get some feedback, you got to revise it, you got to try it again, get some feedback, revise it. All of that stuff needs to happen in order for those three things to solidify as like this connection between my job, my decisions, and my data. And I can talk about all kinds of other ways to be creative, but I think that's a concrete way, I think.
I love everything you just said. I think sometimes when people are newer or we can easily get stuck in our day-to-day roles. There's do I have to? Do I have to give this? Do I have to
That's true. Yeah.
do this?
Yeah.
And one of the questions I've been asking people is, well, what questions do you have about the student? And do you think that this, fill in the blank, is going to help
Hmm.
you answer that?
Yes.
And I think I mean, being very upfront, the logistics, we're all super busy human
Oh
beings. No
gosh,
one's
yes.
ever thought, oh my gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do today because I have nothing, I've caught up on my work. Like those type of things don't happen in our field at all. And so a lot of times we get very stuck into just like, just tell me what to do, tell me what to
So
give,
true.
what's the template here? And I think for some of our more complex cases, we really do need to stop and think, okay, I'm getting paid to do this, to do this
Yeah,
evaluation. I
that's
am
right.
making really important decisions about children's lives.
That's right.
What is the data that would help me make this decision instead of just going along going, well, my district requires me to always give the
So
ADOS every
true.
time we look at autism. Is the
Yeah.
ADOS helping you? Is it helping you?
Yeah.
You know, I've had cases, the ADOS totally helps me, and I'm much more clear about the direction, the decision we are making for this child. And there are other cases where I'm like, that isn't useful. We
Yeah.
already have all of this data. I don't
That's right.
need that extra set of pieces there.
Yeah.
So I love that three-step process. And I love starting with what am I getting paid to do here?
That's right.
And I think the decision piece is a really great kind of perspective because that's what we get to do. We make really important decisions about
Yeah.
children, about interventions, whether it's individual students, groups of students. We make really important decisions. So I love
Yeah.
that kind of backwards mapping of what kind of data is going to help us make these decisions.
I feel like the idea might feel new to people, but I am certain that that folks in general, your audience in particular, can think of elements and experiences in their day-to-day life where they do just that. We just don't see it as like data analysis because it doesn't include, this is the kind of a funny way I put it about it is like we think about data dashboards all the time. Like an actual data dashboard is your literal dashboard in your car, right? Can you just imagine like going on a road trip and just being like, I'm sure it'll be fine. I will probably not run out of gas, but I don't have a gas, I don't have a little, thing that tells me that. You can take this like duty decision data mental model and apply it there and see that it works, right? Look, your job here is to get from San Diego to Sacramento, for example, and not run out of gas because you want to have a good experience. What's the key decision there that you have to make? Well, when do I stop for gas? Well, okay, so what's the information that you need to be able to make that decision well consistently? Jenny, what do you call the gas thing that
Is it a gas gauge?
I can probably
Probably a
say
gas gauge. I
speedometer, but I'm
know.
like,
In my head, I'm like, what is the name of that thing? Let's call it a
yeah,
gas gauge right
yeah.
now.
Jenny's audience, you know what I mean. The gas thing that tells you, right?
Yeah.
You need that. You need that. If you don't have that, you're just like, oh, let's see, I've been going for like 2 hours and I haven't been going that fast, but I think it'll be fine. That's dangerous. You're not going to make that decision really well, right? And so I know that that's kind of a contrived example, but the underlying principle is the same. I think people sometimes are just like, oh, I'm not a data person. I'm like, yeah, you are. Do you check your bank account before you go and make like a really big purchase? Then you're a data person, right? Like, all I'm saying is like find the version of that that applies to your professional life. Use a mental model, of course, but like we all do this work, and to varying sort of like levels of sophistication, of course, but like there are very few of us who operate and make important decisions with no information. Very few of us.
I hope there's very few of us.
Good point.
I hope so. But because unless you have that superpower that you don't need all those different pieces,
Yeah,
oh, that makes me a little nervous, a little
that's right.
nervous.
Exactly. Yeah,
Well, I know you haven't been in the field of school psychology for a while. However, you think about it all the time.
I do. Hmm.
I always think if that's how we got into this world, like
That's
that's
right.
just our mindset.
Yeah.
We have a lot of newer people to the field who are listeners to this podcast. If you had to give them advice, someone starting out in this field, what would be some of those pieces you would share?
I feel like I've been waiting for this moment my whole life. I'm going to tell you, I don't know how common this answer is, but I thought really hard about this. You sent me the questions before. I'm like, this is my chance. What am I going to say? When I imagine myself as like a brand new school psychologist, something like if I could go back in time and sort of teach myself something, it would be to be honest about how long things take to do.
Mm,
And, again, add this to the list of things that I think I only could came to terms with after I left school psychology. But to borrow concepts and tools from project management to make your life better, as a school psychologist, I'll give you a concrete example here. I think, if I have no real concept of how long it takes to write a school psych report, so I'm going to use, like arbitrary numbers here, but like if you've done 100 of these and your best estimate is that it takes 2 1 hour sessions to do it, or 4 30-minute sessions to do it, internally for your own internal planning, you ought to be honest about that. And I think and I'll talk about why I feel so strongly about it in a second for practical reasons, but like I just look back at the way I did it and I was so not honest about that. And it resulted in situations where I'm like, oh man, I have this IEP tomorrow. I'm not ready. I haven't done the report. I don't know when I'm going to do it. I can do it tonight. That's possible. But I know what I'll do. I'm going to take 15 minutes during my lunch and write it. I, it never happens.
never.
And on top of it never happening, which is kind of the worst part about it, then I feel bad about that because I'm just like, I told myself I was going to get it done during the line. And now, like, okay, well, this is not a problem that is like specific to any particular person. I'm pretty sure there's some research around like human beings are just kind of bad about estimating time, like in
Yeah.
general. The reason why I think it's important, well, just two reasons. The first is personal empowerment. I have discovered that if we're honest about how long things take and then we plan accordingly, there is some measure of control that you get back over your work life, right? Because if 4 weeks before that IEP is due, you know that on average, it's not always perfect, but like it takes 4 30-minute sessions to write a report. I'm going to find right now, 4 weeks ahead of time, 30 minutes a time, four of them, that I'm going to block off. They're going to land on my calendar where everybody can see. I don't know if in schools people can sort of see each other's calendars, but advocate for that to be able to see, like to show so that you can block the time off, right? And whenever I like coach people or sort of mentor folks, not just in education, but just in general, I always say like, when you look at all the things that you have to do and sort of all the things that cause you stress in your work, try to put them into three buckets. Number one bucket where most of your entire energy should go, the things that you can control. That's one
Mhm.
category. The second thing that you should be giving whatever time you have, left over, a large amount of like what you have left over, are the things that you can't control entirely, but you can influence.
Mm,
Okay, put some time there, and just acknowledge that you can do everything right. It may not turn out, the way that you imagine it would. And then the third one is the stuff that you can't control or influence. Sometimes you have to do stuff in there anyway, but like make that bucket the smallest thing that you can do. And sometimes I imagine people kind of pushing back on that, saying, "Well, you can't just ignore like whatever kinds of work." And what I would say to those people is, "I have some news for you. You're ignoring it already. All I'm trying because you don't have time.
right.
Nobody does. All I'm suggesting is be strategic about what you don't do. That's all I'm suggesting, right? Because I have not met any school psychologist who has said, "Hey, I had this thing happen to me last year where I was given 1,000 things to do and I did all 1,000 of them." Never. This never happened.
Yeah.
There's at least however many hundreds of things on those things that they didn't do. And I think if we could estimate how much time a thing takes to do, we can organize accordingly. If you want to like practice formal project management stuff, that can be helpful, but I don't think you have to. Just even the concept of like a psych report takes 4 30-minute sessions. I'm not helping anybody if I tell myself I'm going to do this for 15 minutes over lunch and it's going to be done.
Right.
You put yourself in a position where, as stressful as things get, you can at the very least say, I have controlled the elements of this I can control. I've influenced the things that I can. And then, as I like to say, however this turns out, we're going to celebrate as a team. We're going to commiserate as a team. But one thing I know for sure is on the way home, I will tell myself I controlled everything I could. And that's one way it helps. I'll end with the other way that it helps is it empowers you to set logical and fairly provable boundaries,
Yeah.
both with yourself and with other people. Because you could say, somebody comes to you and says, "Hey, I need you to do this thing. Can you please do it this week?" I think everybody who is stressed says like, no, I can't do it this week, right? So that we should set that boundary. I think it's much more powerful to say like, hey, listen, let me kind of tell you what I have happening this week, right? I have 3 IEPs. I have 6 hours of discretionary time. I'm making these numbers up. 6 hours of discretionary time I could block off. All six this week are accounted for because these IEPs are due, next week or in the following days. I think what you're asking me to do, great idea. I would love to do this. The next sort of opportunity I can have to block off time for this is in 2 weeks. Does that work for you? Because I would love to be able to do this if you can just be patient with me. I got one more thing. I think it's very logical for me to think that like your audience is kind of made up of school psychologists and educators. Some of them will continue to do that work. Others may choose to do other work and go into administration, leadership, and stuff like that. And
Hmm.
and for those folks, I would say I understand your plight. You are tasked with so many things to do and not enough time to do it. I think one thing that you can do for your staff is if they work in this way where they block off time, you ask them to do something that needs to be done today or this week, and you see that they've diligently sort of mapped out their work. One thing that you can control as a leader is to say like, thank you for sharing that with me. I could see that you got a lot on your plate and that you can't do this week under these conditions. Let me help you reprioritize.
Hmm.
Move some stuff around, right? Trust your people. Look, I get that there are some people who are just like don't do any thinking and they just say no to everything. Okay, I'm not talking about
Right.
those people. What I'm talking about
Right.
is the person who's just like you're really trying to make this work, right?
Hmm.
Leaders have leaders have the power to help people reprioritize, and I think they ought to embrace that because I feel pretty strongly about this. I think not experiencing the empowerment that comes from organizing your work and getting a lot of stuff done on a regular basis can be really discouraging. Like I've
Yeah.
experienced that myself, and I've experienced it for so long that I feel so strongly about it as a leader and as somebody who sort of listens to people all the time. We ought to be honest about how long things take. Over time, you'll get better and better at your work. You'll find ways to be more concise. You'll be faster. So I'm not saying it'll always take a long time, but all I'm saying is just be honest about how long it takes. At the start of your job, maybe it takes like 3 hours. You get 10 years in, it takes 30 minutes. That's fine. But
Right.
admit that it takes 30 minutes and not five, and then plan accordingly. And that's what I would go back and coach, younger me to do. I would probably also say like that tie that you picked today, like we need to work on that, but that can come like 10 years later. You'll figure it out.
Well, I love that piece. And I love that you added in the role of the leader. And I would say to the school psychologist who maybe that leader isn't taking that initiative, that's also a great question for you to ask as well.
Yeah,
I love how you said, like, this is how many hours I have. I don't feel like I can take this on right now. I could do it in 2 weeks. If they're like, no, 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 this needs to be done now, I would love your help and support in
that's right.
reprioritizing
Yeah.
these tasks.
That's what a
Uh,
leader is supposed to do, right? Is supposed to direct
yeah,
resources.
yeah,
That's what they're supposed to do. And so I know that's hard. If there's a leader that are listening to this and just being like, oh, easy for you to say, well, I know it's hard, but it's
totally
the
hard.
truth. It's the
Yeah.
truth, and yeah.
Well, my last question that I always ask all my guests, and now I'm curious if you have something different, because I think your last answer could also help you with this.
Yep, yep.
Our podcast is called the Prepared School Psych Podcast. When you think of the word prepared, what do you do to help yourself feel more prepared in all your many roles?
Yeah, I'm going to go super, super, super duper practical here with a routine that I've done. I don't even know, like as far back as I can remember, but I find it so helpful. Every Friday morning, maybe, but like, afternoon during the workday, set aside 30 minutes or 45 minutes and look at every single day on your calendar for the next 2 weeks and pay attention internally to what's happening inside of you and what your brain is telling you, the messages it's sending you as you go through each of those days. And in particular, that feeling that the brain sort of signals that says like, oh man, I haven't even started that thing yet. I can't believe that's in 4 days. Listen to that and figure out how much time it'll take to get started. Schedule that time to work on it. Do that every Friday. And, you know, similar to what I've said earlier, you can do every best practice. And I believe that will contribute to things going the way you want them to most of the time, but it won't be all the time. But this is something that you can do, I think, that will increase the amount of times that you feel in control and will decrease the amount of times that you wake up in the morning, show up to work feeling great, and be like, oh, that meeting's in an hour. That's not ready. Nobody likes that. It feels horrible and it's not great for kids. But if you sort of, spend regular time, I like to do it Fridays in the afternoons, and I sort of look at, and as you get into like leadership and you're responsible for longer time horizons, a month or 6 months, and you look out maybe like a month in advance or something, or a quarter in advance. But like the point is, look out and look at what's on your calendar and allow that experience to change the way you thought you were going to be spending the next week and act on it.
I love that. Ryan, thank you so much for this conversation
Oh, you're
today.
welcome.
I have truly, truly enjoyed our time together. Thank you for your time and all of the wonderful wisdom that you have shared with the audience today. Thank you.
Oh, you're so welcome. Thanks for having me on here. This is fun. This is fun. I just don't get to talk about this very much. And having like talked as much as I did today, sorry, folks, I realized, oh man, this has been like, I've been kind of like keeping this inside for a little while. So thank you for giving me the opportunity to share.
Of course, of course. And to all the listeners, thank you for joining us on the Prepared School Psych podcast. Continue to learn, grow, and make an impact for your students and communities. And I will see you all in the next episode. That concludes another episode of the Prepared School Psych podcast. And I hope today's discussion equipped you not just with knowledge, but also the confidence to take action. Remember, every conversation we have and every resource we share builds a bridge towards a more inclusive and empowering learning landscape for our students. If you enjoyed this episode, be sure to subscribe to the podcast for more insightful conversations and resources to support your journey. Share this podcast with colleagues. We would love it if you would also rate and review the podcast. Thank you for tuning in. Just a reminder, everyone, the information and advice provided in this podcast are for guidance purposes only, and all listeners are required to follow both federal and state law and their own school district guidelines and policies. Thank you.